So good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this morning at our summer webinar. And this morning we're going to be talking about data management for social scientists. My name's Jenny O'Neill, and I'm one of two of the data managers with ISSDA, which is the Irish Social Science Data Archive. We are an archive for quantitative social science data. We are based at UCD Library, and we are part funded by the Irish Research Council. And we have developed this series of webinars. We're going to do about 4 a year. So if there's anything you'd like us to cover, please do let me know in the chat or afterwards by email. I'd be delighted to hear from you. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to look at this morning, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth in anything in particular, but just to kind of give you an introductory feel to things. So we're going to look a little bit about what we mean by research data. I'm going to introduce the concept of fair data, which is something any of you who are applying for funding are probably have come across. How much you may know about that is another thing. So we'll give a little overview of that. We're going to look at the importance of data management plans and how you might put one together. And then rather than going into every section of the data management plan itself, I've picked out a few that I think are specifically important for social scientists. So looking at organizing your data, creating documentation and metadata, looking at the ethics and data protection perspectives as well if you're working with human participants, and then also how you can go about sharing your data at the end of your research project. Spoiler alert, ISSDA is one way of doing that. So let's have a little look at kind of the data management basics to start off with. When I speak to researchers, I tend to speak to a lot of different disciplines and sometimes all at once, and it can be quite difficult to find a definition of research data that fits for everybody. But this is one that I quite like. Research data are documents in a digital form other than scientific publications, which are collected or produced in the course of scientific research activities and are used as evidence in the research process or are commonly accepted in the research community as necessary to validate findings and results. So if you think about your own research and think about the data that you are generating as part of that research project, what are you relying on as evidence? So when you're writing up your papers, what is the evidence on which you're relying? And what does the community in general consider to be necessary to validate findings and results? So really, when you're thinking about your own specific research, these are the things that you're thinking about. And this is what research data means to you. That could be transcripts of interviews or questionnaires. It could be images or videos, depending on the discipline. If we go outside of the social sciences, it could be genomics data. It could be sensor data. It really depends on your specific discipline, but what do you rely on as evidence in the research process, and what does your particular discipline consider to be necessary to validate research findings? And that's what you want to think about when you're thinking about your own research data and managing those data. So when we look at data management, it really covers the whole life cycle of a research project, from the creation of the data, whether that's creating your questionnaire, your ethical application form, your consent procedures, to documenting the data as you go along, to using the data, obviously to format your own conclusions. During the process, you're going to obviously have to store those data somewhere and perhaps share them across a research team. Longer term, then you want to think about sharing them with the with other researchers, with the community, and preserving them for the long term. So making sure that they're going to remain accessible into the future. So when we talk about data management, we're really talking about activities at all of these different points in the research life cycle. Some of them are more kind of day-to-day management during the research project, but also thinking about what's going to happen to the data once the project has finished in terms of the long-term management. I'm going to introduce the FAIR data principles, and I'm really just going to talk very briefly about them because I think it's something that is very useful to be aware of, but you may not need or be interested in going into a huge amount of detail on them. So the FAIR data principles were developed originally in 2016 by a group of funders and researchers and research performing organizations. And they say that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this is really thinking about data at the end of the research project. So once you've completed your research and you want to make your data available, you should be thinking about making it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the easiest way to do that is to make the data available in a repository or archive. This is really simplifying it a huge amount, but really the first steps towards fairer data are to make the data available in a repository or archive. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Most repositories and archives will assign some kind of persistent identifier. The most common one is a DOI, or a digital object identifier, which is what you'll probably be used to seeing at the end of your publication citations. So it's the exact same. You get a DOI for your publication and you get a DOI for your data, which means that you can track the reuse and the citation of those data. Rich metadata is incredibly important for FAIR data, and I'm going to talk a little bit about metadata for social sciences in a few minutes. But really you want to provide as much information with the data, describing the data, as you possibly can. And this will make your data as fair as possible. And a repository will also assign a clear license, which means that others know what they can and can't do with your data. And that kind of speaks to the reusability aspect. The interoperability is much more complex and requires that you're considering international standards and best practices within the discipline, using scales which have already been tested and made available, so that your data can be compared with other data. So you may have somebody running a similar study to your own in France or Germany or wherever. And if you are using similar scales, if you're using those standards, your data will be interoperable with their data. You can suddenly start to do cross-national comparisons or longitudinal comparisons if the data have been generated in the same way. So that's the interoperability bit. It's a lot more complex, but in terms of making your data fair, so findable, accessible, and reusable, really making your data available in a repository or archive is the best way to do this and to achieve this. So if you are asked to address the FAIR data principles in your funding application, saying that you're going to make your data available is the easiest way and the best way to do that. In terms of a data management plan, which is something I would very much recommend exists for every research project, whether it's mandated or not. A lot of the funders are now beginning to mandate that you create a data management plan. For example, within Horizon Europe, you're required to create, I think it's a 1 or 2 page data management plan at the funding application stage, and then a full data management plan a couple of months post-award. This is the same for the HRB, and SFI and IRC are beginning now to require that for certain funding calls. So data management plan, or a DMP, is a formal document that outlines how the data will be handled both during the research project, but also after the project is completed. We really want you to create this document to help you think about what you're doing at an early stage in the research process, which will help you make the right choices for your data as you go through the project. And as we're going to discuss in a few minutes, if you're working with human participants and you want to make the data available at the end of the project, you must have consent to do that from an ethical point of view at the beginning of the project. So that's something that you need to be thinking about before you even start collecting your data. If you want to make your data as interoperable as possible, again, this is something you need to be thinking about at the very beginning of the research process. We want to get researchers thinking about how to make their data fair. And as you step through the data management plan, you realize that a lot of the questions that you're being prompted to ask of yourself and of the research project align to the FAIR data principles. Depending on the size of the group that you're working with, a data management plan can be a really useful tool to create awareness and agreement within a research group. So whether that's 2 or 3 people working together, or whether that's a multinational, multi-partner, large project, having a document that outlines how data are going to be handled, where they're going to be stored, what documentation is going to be generated, where they're going to be put at the end of the project, and who's responsible for all of those steps is a really, really useful document to have, because by being in control of your own data management, ideally the research gets better and gets more efficient as well. So most data management plans follow a pretty similar framework. The most commonly used one is the Science Europe guidelines for creating a data management plan. I also work within UCD Library, supporting researchers in UCD, and the template that we use is based on the Science Europe guidelines. SFI and HRB also point to these guidelines as sources of support when you're creating your own data management plan. Horizon Europe have taken a slightly different look at things. So they are asking specifically about the fair data aspects, what you're going to do with the data at the end of the project. And it does kind of skip some of those interim steps. So I do recommend that you have a look at those Science Europe guidelines when you're creating your data management plan. A really useful tool in creating the data management plan is DMP Online. You can sign in quite often using your institutional credentials. And if your institution has created its own template, as UCD has, you can select that, or you can select your funder's template. Or if neither of those are available to you, you can use the generic template, which again is based on these Science Europe guidelines. So really there is alignment across most of the actors in this space. So what you're going to be asked to do is fill in questions relating to the data description. So what data are you actually collecting? Documentation and data quality, and this includes how you're going to organize the data and what metadata you're going to generate. Storage and backup. So where are you going to store the data during the research project? And particularly if you are working with human participants, as I would guess most of you probably are, that's going to be very important in terms of making sure that you're securing those personal data throughout the research project. So the storage, the backup, and the security aspects as well. It'll also prompt you to think about any legal or ethical requirements that exist. I'm going to talk specifically about the ethical consent for data sharing, but also briefly looking at GDPR and the data protection regulations. It'll also ask you about data sharing and long-term preservation. How are you going to select which data need to be shared? Where are you going to make those available? What resources do you need to support that? And then the data management resources and responsibilities. Do you need to buy in additional storage for your project? Who is going to be responsible for the storage and backup? Who is going to be responsible for making sure that the data are available at the end of the project? So it's really about, I suppose, assigning people to the various different aspects of the data management plan to make sure that it's being fully carried out. In terms of the costs, if there are costs that you encounter in relation to data management, most of those can be fulfilled through your grant. But again, you need to know in advance that you are going to encounter these costs in order to be able to put them into your funding application. So again, planning for these things at the very beginning of the project will hopefully make things an awful lot easier. So looking at data organization a little bit, the first thing we want to think about, really, particularly within the social sciences, is file formats. We want to make sure that the file formats are open, non-proprietary file formats where possible. Most archives and repositories will give a list of preferred formats, which is the formats that they really prefer that you use, and acceptable formats. So even if you don't plan on making your data available through these archives or repositories, they can still support you in understanding best practice. You'll see here, this is from the ISSDA file format policy, that we prefer SPSS portable files or tab delimited files with setup files for SPSS SAS and Stata. Excuse me. So our acceptable formats are SPS, SAS and Stata. These have to a certain extent become the de facto norms within the discipline. However, each of these pieces of software are incredibly expensive to buy. And if you're working outside of a higher education institution where you likely have access to them, it is causing a barrier to people creating or to using your data. So that's why we would recommend that you create a tab delimited file where possible for long-term preservation and storage. Within documentation, again, we prefer PDF-A, which is an archival format, but there are other formats which are acceptable. From our perspective within the archive, it's much easier for us to manage these non-proprietary formats, or indeed PDF-A, because the standards behind the formats have been made openly available, which means in 50 years' time, if SPSS is no longer a useful format or a usable format, that we will be able to create new formats for the data. With SPSS, we don't own the rights to the data themselves, the standard, I suppose, or the software. So it makes it a little bit more difficult in those cases to make sure that we can maintain access to the data. So it's just worth thinking about the file formats that you're going to be generating. These might be different for the active phase of the research. So what the standards that you're using, the file formats that you're using as you're going through your research, you may end up then converting to a different format at the end of the research project for that long-term preservation and sharing. In terms of good documentation, good documentations allows others to find and understand your data. Within the social sciences domains, if you are carrying out questionnaires or interviews, you want to make sure that you're including with the data the interview protocol, the questionnaire, or any interviewer's instructions that were given. If you're working with tabular data, make sure that you're creating a code book or a data dictionary, so that other people can understand the data. So a code book or data dictionary will outline the variable name, the variable label, but also the value names and the value labels. So if you're working on a scale of 1 to 5, within SPSS, you'll just have coded 1 to 5, but the code book or data dictionary will outline what 1 means and what 5 means and everything in between. So it's just making sure that other researchers have all of the information that they need to be able to interpret your data. Also very useful are the information sheets that you created to provide with the studies, obviously consent forms, but blank consent forms, or if you have ethical approval, it's useful to include the information about the ethical approval. If you create any methodology reports as part of your research process, if you have information on the anonymization that was done, the protocols that you used for that or for data cleaning, these can be really useful to help somebody else understand all the processes that your data went through. And then if you're using any existing sources of data, for example, through ISSDA, to either compare with your own data, you need to make sure that you're making the provenance information about those sources very clear. So where did you access the data from, and how can somebody else access it? Metadata is something which some of you may have heard of, but probably don't know all that much about. I am a librarian by training, so this is something we're very familiar with in the library world. So metadata tells us a story about the data, while documentation is unstructured in a lot of ways. Metadata is much more structured, and we rely on international standards to create the metadata. The two that are probably most commonly used within the social sciences are Dublin Core, and this is a list of about 15 different elements which can describe your data. Within ISSDA, we use the Data Documentation Initiative, which is the recommended standard for quantitative research data. But if you're interested in learning more, or if you have data which you don't feel fits into either of these standards, you can have a look at the Metadata Standards Directory. So just explain a little bit more about what metadata is. If you think of going to a library website, and I work in UCD Library, so that's the one that I would be most familiar with. You type in either the name of a book or a subject or a topic that you're interested about, and you'll find a record for a book on the website as part of the catalogue. It will tell you the name of the book, who wrote it, when it was written, what edition it is, who published it. And these are all things that can help you understand where the book has come from, what the background of it is, whether it's a recent book, whether it's the most up-to-date edition that you want to look at. where it was published and who it was published by. It will also give you information about what's in the book. So it will most likely have the subjects that the book covers. It'll have a location, where on the library shelves can you find that book. And it will also have information which is really useful for librarians. So how tall is the book? What's the height of the book? How many pages are in the book, which helps us to understand the physical size and shape of the book, so that when librarians are shelving them, we can make the best use out of the space that we have available. So it's not the book itself, it's just a lot of information about the book. And that's what metadata is. It's not your actual data set, but it's a lot of information about the data set, which can help you to understand whether or not you think these data might be useful for your purposes. Within ISSDA, as I mentioned, we use the Data Documentation Initiative to generate metadata, and we do this through the ISSDA Data Deposit form. So when a researcher comes to ISSDA and is interested in depositing their data, we have a Word document that we ask them to fill in, which is what we use to generate the DDI metadata. So things that we will ask about are the study title, who was the principal investigator, who was responsible for the research. We'll ask for an abstract. We'll ask for keywords and for study topics. What was the time dimension of the study? So what was the start date and the end date? What was the study area? So whereabouts did the study take place? The unit of analysis is the universe or the population that was studied. What sampling procedures were used? How were the data collected? So whether it was an online questionnaire or a face-to-face questionnaire, for example, and then the data collection period. You'll see in the square brackets that we also use a lot of international thesauri and ontologies, which help us make sure that our data are interoperable with other metadata. So we have the ISSDA topic classification or the European Language Social Science Thesaurus, which help us make sure that we're using international standards for the topics and for the keywords. The ISO 31662 letter for the study area is the international and internationally recognized standard for countries. And then there are a number of standards which are also applicable specifically to DDI, which have been developed by DDI, and we will use those so that the metadata that we create are interoperable with other social science archives across Europe. So from an ethics and data protection point of view, I'm going to talk about this quite briefly because I will hopefully do a much more in-depth webinar in the future about both ethics and data protection because they're incredibly complex areas, which is very difficult to do justice to them in just a couple of minutes. But really just to be aware that if you are doing social science research, so research with human participants, and you want to make the data available at the end of the project, you must get informed consent to do that. And you must explain within the information leaflet how the data are going to be used. So is it just going to be used for this particular project? Do you intend to use it in future follow-on projects just yourself? Or do you intend to share the data with the research community? You can include like a series of tick boxes so people can say they are happy for their data to be used by you or happy for their data to be shared with the research community in a pseudonymized form. So just to be aware that if you want to make the data available, you really do need to plan for that from the very beginning. In terms of the General Data Protection Regulations, which is GDPR, I'm sure most people have heard about it at some stage. So we've always had data protection legislation and regulations, but GDPR really has a lot more protections for participants within it. And it applies to any research that uses personal data. So this includes any scientific research or studies in the arts and humanities or social sciences where people are involved. So it's important that you are aware of your requirements within that. And it's also important to know, if you're working in the health sphere, that Ireland also introduced detailed health research regulations, so that anybody working with health related personal data, research data, also needs to be aware of their obligations around that. As I said, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail here because it gets quite complex quite quickly, but just so that you are aware that you need to make sure that you're in compliance with the legislation, that you're looking at whatever information your institution has made available around this. Most institutions, or in fact all institutions, will have a data protection officer who may be able to advise you or provide advice around this. So then we're going to look at data sharing. So we've looked at how you're going to manage the data within the research project, what documentation and metadata you're going to generate as you go along, thinking about those ethical and legal considerations. And now we're going to look at what's going to happen to the data after the project has finished. So ideally, we want to make our data as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. And I quite like this because we have the competing priorities of the funders to make the data open, but then the legislation to keep personal data closed. So we always say, make it as open as you possibly can, while recognizing that there will be plenty of times where that is just not appropriate to do so. If you are interested in making your data available for preservation of research data, we would recommend that your data are deposited with a discipline-specific community recognized repository. There's a couple of really good reasons for this. Your data are going to sit with other data of a similar type, so they're going to be more findable. That archive will have expertise in managing that specific type of data. So they are also likely to have advice and guidance on file formats, on documentation, on metadata. So you know that you're by following their guidelines, even if you don't end up depositing the data with them, you know that you're following best practice within the discipline. People are more likely to search a disciplinary repository in the first place if they're looking to access data. And the archive will also be able to manage the long-term aspects of it as well a little bit better. So if they need to change the formats, file formats in the future to support their designated community, that's easier to do if you're dealing with a much smaller subset, a discipline-specific repository. If no discipline-specific repository exists for your discipline, or you just don't feel that any of them are a good fit for your data, there are a lot of multidisciplinary repositories available where you can put your data. The most common one I would think is probably Zenodo, where you can put your data, and you can also apply restrictions, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, within Zenodo. So disciplinary repository, if it exists, is your first port of call. If that doesn't exist, then you might want to think about using a multidisciplinary repository. With social science data, obviously, if you are working with human participants, even if the data have been pseudonymized, you still need to make sure that you're protecting your participants' privacy all the way. So it is possible to restrict access to your data. And in these restricted data archives, researchers will identify the data that they think would be useful to them, and they will use the documentation and the metadata to help them decide if your data are going to be suitable for their project. They will generally complete an access form or a request form, whether that's for research purposes or teaching purposes. And then that access is granted or denied based on the information in the request form. So by restricting access to your data, you're ensuring that only the people who need access are actually given access, that your data are not being made publicly available or for anybody to access. I'm just going to close the window in case you can hear the noise from the builders down the road. So if you are working with human participant data, really a restricted access repository is most likely going to be the best home for your data. Within Ireland, even we have a couple of different options available. The Irish Social Science Data Archive that I represent, obviously, would be my recommendation if you're working with quantitative research data. But also the Irish Qualitative Data Archive, IQDA, are based at Maynooth University. So if you're working with qualitative data, I would recommend that you have a look at their archive. Again, they have a lot of really excellent recommendations and resources around best practice. The Digital Repository of Ireland is also another good option. This is a membership organisation, so your institution would need to be a member in order for you to deposit data with them. And that's, I suppose, the funding model that they rely on in order to keep going. So you might need to check and see if your institution is a member of DRI. And then if you are looking for data or you have data at a European level, the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives is where I would suggest you start looking to see what archives are available within your specific country or jurisdiction. So all of these archives are restricted access archives. They accept pseudonymized data, so no direct identifiers within the data, but while recognizing that from a legal perspective, the barrier for fully anonymized data is extremely high. So instead of making your data fully open, you are restricting access to people who only to people who need and are justified in having access to those data. So I'm also going to point you as a really great resource to the ISSDA Data Management Expert Guide. It goes into, it's kind of a self-paced online course that you can do, and it goes into a huge amount more detail on all of the different aspects of everything I've talked about this morning, of all of the different sections of the data management plan. It was developed by social science data experts from across Europe, so all of the members of ISSDA were involved in creating it, and it is tailored specifically for social scientists as well. So if you're interested in learning more about anything that I've mentioned this morning, the ISSDA Data Management Expert Guide is where I would point you to for more information. So I'm going to stop talking there, and we have plenty of time for questions. We do have a newsletter if you would like to sign up for that. We will only be sending it quarterly, so we won't inundate you with a lot of information. We also have a Twitter account where we post updates on upcoming webinars and new data sets that are available. So I would recommend you have a look there if you're interested in following along with all the work that we're doing. So we've loads of time for questions. If anybody would like to unmute themselves, you are more than welcome to do that, or if you want to type something into the chat either. And then for those of you who don't have questions, I would ask if there's anything else you would like us to cover in the future, please let me know and we will consider that. So there's a request for the slides. I absolutely will email a copy of the slides this afternoon to everybody who registered for the webinar. I'm recording this as well. I'm going to stop recording now. So I've stopped recording. No, I haven't. I've stopped sharing, not stopped recording.